My guest today is John Van Reenen. John is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of innovation, and he's the author of the book Investing for Prosperity. More recently, he has worked on the measurement of management practices and their impact on productivity. John, it's great to have you here. I guess I have to welcome you back in Europe since you're back to the LSE after your period in MIT. Although on the other hand, I don't know if I should count the UK as Europe anymore.
I think you should. And I'm glad. The only trouble with being back is that you're not at LSE anymore, Louis. So we miss, we miss you.
Thank you.
Maybe one day.
Maybe one day. That would be excellent. So you've been doing a huge amount of work. One of the most productive economists around, and a lot of it is very interesting to think about the future of capitalism and what things are, what is happening, what need to change. And I want to start by one which is very recent research work that you've conducted on innovation and this idea of the Lost Einsteins. The question that you pose is who becomes an inventor in America, and to what extent everybody kind of has the chance to become an inventor, or only certain people with certain backgrounds. And we have a beautiful example in Europe right now, which are these Turkish immigrants who, coming out of literally the second generation, the first generation, their parents came to Germany, have managed to found a company, BioNTech, which is the pioneer in the vaccination for the COVID. They've really done these innovative techniques of messenger RNA and have really probably are going to change the history of the world. So you studied this database. What are the main conclusions of your study, to just frame it generally first, please?
Yeah, so exactly as you said, so we're very interested in who becomes an inventor and who doesn't. So, I mean, going back to your whole original question about the future of capitalism and why we're interested in this, really what we're thinking about is, what policies can we do to stimulate growth in Europe and around the world? And one of the best ways to do that is to try and improve the supply, the quantity and quality of inventors. So the way we decided to look at that was, this is an American study, but I think this is going to be true in other countries as well, is to look at where innovators come from, where inventors come from, what their backgrounds were, how they grew up. And the way that we did this is that we, how do you define an inventor? Well, we looked at one of the indicators of that, which is whether you take a patent or not. So, if you applied or granted a patent, that's an indicator that you've done something new in the world. So that was our measure. And we took every American who was on a patent since 1996 to today, and that was our measure of millions of inventors. And then we matched that to the backgrounds. So we had information from the IRS, so we knew what incomes they had, we knew what incomes their parents had, we knew what the gender was, we had for a subsample what the ethnicity was, so we could look at this, as you said, the kind of issue of our minorities more or less likely to invent. And then we just laid out some, I think, very important facts that I think people hadn't kind of realized before. So people know that, for example, women are much less likely to be inventors than men are. That's a well-known fact. It's also true that if you look at ethnicity, African Americans are less likely to be inventors than white people are. But one of the startling things we found was, if you look at how rich your parents were, that's a very strong predictor about whether you're going to grow up to be an inventor or not. So, for example, if you were born in the top 1%, if your parents were in the top 1% of income, you were 10 times more likely to grow up to be an inventor than if your parents were in the bottom 50%. So it's an order of magnitude higher. And, that's an interesting fact. Many people say, well, that's not surprising because, there's a reason why people are rich, because they're so clever. And maybe if they're so clever, their kids are really clever. And that's, that is simply, it's because, it's a genetic thing, perhaps, that, you pass on your brilliance to your kids. But one thing we could do in our data is we actually could get hold for a subsample of the data, the kind of early scores that these kids got at school. So we knew their math tests when they were 8, their kind of English tests, and a whole bunch of things about them. And it's true that if the kids who are born to wealthier families tend to have better scores than the kids who are born to poor families, but that only explained a very small amount of the difference. Most of that difference wasn't to do with ability of the kids, the talent of the kids. it appeared to be to do with something else. And we argued in the paper that a lot of the effects came from whether or not you were exposed to the possibility of being an inventor when you were growing up. So, for example, the amount of innovation in the area where you lived when you were a kid, when you were growing up, was very strongly correlated whether you became an inventor when you were old. Even if you'd moved away and gone to a different area, even in the very narrow technology class, which was important in that particular area. So, and even when we looked at kids who like moved into the area when they were young compared to kids who moved into the area when they're a bit older, it really looked as if this exposure effect was important. So, to me, it kind of suggests that this exposure, I mean, from my background, I know when I was at school, I went to a pretty low quality school. And the idea of us growing up to be an inventor or an entrepreneur, nobody even thought about it. Nobody even, most kids wouldn't even thought of going to university. Most of the kids dropped out when they were 16. So just this idea of being exposed, I think is very important of driving about whether you're an inventor or not. And it has a lot of policy implications. I think if you want to talk about that, we could do so.
It makes me, before I ask you that, it makes me want to ask you something I haven't been asking economists now. I'm sorry I didn't. Which is how did you make the leap from that school to actually yourself wanting to be an inventor in our own way, which is a researcher, a creator of ideas, and how did it happen? You didn't have people around just to apply your own.
Yeah, well, I think I did because I was lucky. So my my father was an immigrant, so he was he came from South Africa when he was 16. My grandfather was a political refugee. He had to leave South Africa. Hence the Van Reenen name. It's a kind of South African name. And he kind of he struggled a bit when he was here. He had to retake exams, but he eventually became an academic. He was a sociologist, and he was very encouraging to me also to also think about ideas and to talk about ideas. So even though the school I ended up with wasn't a particularly good school, I got a lot of exposure through him and through his friends, and that I think was very important for me.
So this is fascinating, and it does chime with this idea we all think of Steve Jobs and Ballmer and all this. What is the partner of Steve Jobs? Wozniak.
Oh yes,
Wozniak.
Was
in their garage doing this, and they were living in these communities where everybody was tinkering with computers and so on. So it does fit kind of this idea of contagion, of exposure to ideas. It seems very reasonable, but from a policy perspective, it's not very encouraging, because we cannot just spread inventors in every neighborhood to make sure everybody's exposed to the idea they can invent. How do we solve these kind of problems that are not just, okay, you have to give money to schools to be better, which is already a difficult enough thing, but you have to present kids with role models, with an environment. What is your policy?
So I think there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, we don't know the policy the solutions to this, but I think there's a lot of different things. I mean, one of the things is, I think, as you were hinting at, is that if you go to a school or a neighborhood where the schools are not good, where you're not getting this exposure, I think one of the kind of policies you can think of is to say, well, let's try and find some of the talented kids who show some aptitude at an early age for math or for science, and then do things within the school to try and support them. So for example, David Card of Berkeley has this fantastic study of what happened when they tried to track kids in school in some lower income schools, and they found that for most of these kids, it's like a gift and talented because it didn't make much difference, but for the minority kids who happened to get into this, it made an enormous difference. So I think the idea of trying to identify at an early stage the kids with potential, giving them some extra help, extra resources, extra encouragement, could be a really powerful thing to do. And that's not expensive, actually. So in David's study, actually, the cost of this was pretty low. So that's one set of things around the kind of schooling. There's another set of things, and I think that there's some basic things, like there is this program in the US where they kind of basically give kids who are thinking of studying STEM or from disadvantaged backgrounds large bursaries to go and study in college. So just like $10,000 just to go. So that would be one. That was abolished actually by Congress. And that, I think, I've been trying to encourage as part of my I have a Biden policy proposal to kind of, stimulate American growth. And that's part of the package of things I'd want. But a third thing is like the role model type of issue. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting work done by foundations like the Conrad Foundation, Lemelson Foundation, who try and expose kids by, there's sending people around different schools who are, people from unusual backgrounds, maybe minority backgrounds or women in science or low-income backgrounds, and going into these schools and just talking to them. I remember that actually. That was one of the things from my school. I remember there was somebody who came from Oxford who was a working class girl who'd gone to Oxford, and she gave a talk, and that was a bit of an inspiration for us that maybe we could also think about going to a good university. So that's another thing. Having competitions. So Lemelson Foundation, for example, has these competitions that kids can enter, for entrepreneurship or invention, and there's various prizes that encourages them to go in, and so I think there's a whole load of things. I think what we need to think about is how we evaluate these different programs. So which ones work and which ones don't work. So I think we don't have, because these are not programs typically people think of as innovation policies. They're not things that actually are studied enough and evaluated in the same way people evaluate welfare programs or tax policy. So I think there's a whole new founds of work which could be done by a new generation of researchers looking to see what works. And the wonderful thing about this, if you think about it, if you can have these type of policies, these supply side policies, to increase the quality and quantity of inventors, not only is that good for equity and social justice, because you're getting discriminated kids in who wouldn't be there, but it's also good for growth. So it's one of these kind of win-win type of policies. This is both good for equity and also good for growth.
This last point that you're making, I think, is really very interesting, right? Many people would say, well, I don't care for inequality, or I don't care for poverty. Some people would think that. And then you tell them, look, I mean, there are all these lost Einsteins who could be having ideas. And you one figure you give in your work is that if people who are not innovating, groups who have not as many innovators, minorities, women, people from low-income families, were inventing at the same rate as white men from high income, the rate of innovation in America would quadruple. So you're really kind of giving a completely new spin to fighting against inequality, which is not just, okay, it's a question of fairness, it's a question of finishing up with populism and all these things, but it's also a question of growth.
And I think that's, to me, those are the policies we need to be thinking of, because we need to be, I mean, I think one of the issues, one of the crises of capitalism that we have is that the growth model we had before COVID wasn't delivering for large parts of the population. So, a lot of the growth which we had, especially in America, was going to the kind of top 1% or the kind of wealthiest people. And we need to think of growth models which both get more growth, because we do have slow growth. That's certainly one problem. But they have also to be ones which try and spread that growth more widely to tackle some of the roots of inequality. So really, I passionately believe those are, and even if you thought it's a pure matter of politics, to get some bipartisan policies through. I mean, this is what Biden's going to face, no matter who wins the Georgia runoffs in a few weeks. He's going to have to reach over the aisle to at least get a few senators on his side. And I think these type of policies, which are both good for social justice and good for growth, are exactly the kind of policies that we need to be thinking of.
This takes us straight into a second paper of yours and a second idea of yours that I wanted to discuss, which is the idea that innovation is actually getting harder, that ideas are getting harder to find. Your basic story is that economic growth is the result of how productive is each researcher and how many researchers. And what it seems is that, and I want just explains that research productivity is falling. We have many more people, but we're not finding as many ideas. Tell us a little bit the facts that you find here, and what do you think is the interpretation? What's going on? Are we just already digging? Did we already invent all the easy things to invent, all the low-hanging fruit? Is that what happens?
I mean, there's some truth in that. I mean, I think the basic idea is like, the fonts of growth that comes from new ideas, from innovation. It's not just how many people you throw at it or how many machines you throw at things. It's really about what you do with those people and those machines. So it's about ideas, and the fountain of ideas is really people, innovating and being researchers and coming up with those ideas. And the problem that we have is that we've been increasing the number of people in wealthy countries, but also in places like China, enormously. But the rate of economic growth, the rate of productivity growth hasn't risen, even though we've increased all these people. Now, the basic growth theory, the endogenous growth theory, says that we should have had this big increase of growth. And the fact is, we have had some growth, but it hasn't been as much as we would think of. So, an example, one particular example which I find very striking is when you think of what technologists call Moore's law, which is this growth of a phenomenal growth of productivity in the kind of semiconductor industry. So, coming from Gordon Moore's prediction that you could basically double the amount of transistors you get in a silicon chip every 18 months to 2 years, and that's been more or less true. They've managed. The semiconductor industry has managed this rate of productivity growth, which is about 35% per annum, enormous. So that seems to be a great example of success. But if you look at that growth, 35% per annum, it's been broadly the same over the last kind of 40, 50 years. But the amount of research which has gone into producing that rate of growth has gone up by a factor of 18 since the kind of early 1970s. So we've had this 18-fold increase of researchers, but productivity growth has stayed the same. And that's if you look, we looked at semiconductors, we looked at healthcare, cancer treatments, and we looked at kind of crops where we can kind of measure these things very carefully. We can get the outputs and inputs, and across the whole of the US economy as a whole, and you see the same kind of pattern. So there's lots of reasons why that could be. I mean, the most obvious reason is that ideas are subject to some diminishing returns, just like everything else. That we know from, as academics, it takes longer and longer for someone to read all the papers and read all the books to get up to the frontier. People are spending longer and longer in graduate school just in order to get up to it, because just the amount of knowledge is much higher. So some of the easier things have been picked. To get to the frontier is harder. The teams of scientists are larger, so it's harder to often communicate. So I think that's just I find it, in one way it's unsurprising, but it is a challenge, because it means that if we want to enjoy the rates of growth that we've got used to, then we have to put in more effort, we have to put in more resources, and we have been doing that. But it means that if we start reducing those amounts of resources, if we start reducing the amounts of researchers, then growth is going to fall very substantially. So one thing we point to is that if you look at in America, the amount of money the government gives towards research and development, that's kind of collapsed from, it was about 1.9% of GDP in the mid-60s, and now it's about 0.7% of GDP. And a lot of, you think about the kind of government R&D often goes towards the more basic R&D, which creates a lot of spillover benefits to the rest of society. So, if we want to get back to growth, part of that has to be to put more resources into R&D. So so go ahead.
No, finish up.
No, I was going to say, people often take from our paper, oh, well, we should be putting less, it's getting lesser return, so we should put less resources into it. In fact, it's the opposite. If we want to, reinvigorate growth, we have to be thinking of ways to get, yes, more efficiency out of our research, but also we have to put, substantial amounts of money. Now, of course, the amount of money we put into research is very small compared to the amount of money we put into other things. So, we put 0.7, the US government puts 0.7% of GDP into R&D. It puts 18% into healthcare. So, I'm not saying it should reduce the healthcare, but the orders of magnitude are hugely different.
Yes, we can see this year with the vaccines. I mean, we've had trillions of euros worth of losses, and I mean, the amount of research is not even in several orders of magnitude.
Exactly.
So, I mean, what your argument makes me think of a much more informal argument that Bob Gordon, a Northwestern macroeconomist, has been making in his book and several papers, that was kind of informal, but I don't know if you would care to comment. Basically, he's been saying, look, it looks to us like things are changing a lot. The world is advancing, and we have Twitter, we have internet. And he says, well, look, information production activities, yes, they are more affected by the internet. But the fact is, the big changes from internal combustion engine to airplanes to televisions to radios to electricity happened in a few years at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. Those were the big innovative ideas that come from physics. And at some level, he would say vaccines in the 1920s also, by the way, no, antibiotics, sorry. Antibiotics are from the 1920s. So all of these big ideas are relatively old. They produce a burst of innovation. And he would say, maybe this is here to stay. Maybe there is something fundamental about the fact that the hardest problems and the most interesting problems, have the ones with most productivity impact, have been solved. Do you think it's just mere speculation, or do you think that it's possible that we have an illusion that the technology in the world changes very fast, but the planes are the same planes, the kitchens are the same, the electricity is the same? I mean, at some level, maybe everything already else, many of those things were already invented.
No, but I mean, I've discussed this with Bob over the years, and his book is fantastic, by the way. The Rise and Fall of American Growth is really well worth kind of reading. There's lots of case studies of specific industries. So yeah, he has these. There was the Industrial Revolution as well. So yeah, as the first, well, that steam and power, that did something. And the second one, which is the one he focuses on, is, he says we're still reaping the benefits of that, but it's kind of dying out. And I think there isn't some essential truth in what he's saying. I agree with him that ideas are becoming harder to find. As he says, I also agree we have this, we have a certain illusion that we think everything is new and sparkling and amazing. But as you said, the indoor plumbing was actually an amazing. I remember that when my grandparents got indoor plumbing in their house in Liverpool. That was a big improvement from the outdoor toilet, I can tell you. So that is certainly a big thing. And whether it's Facebook as good as that, so I think there is that kind of almost illusion of the new that we have, but it's not totally illusory. These innovations do things which improve our lives, and on average, having computers enabled us to do things like we're doing now. Communicate over a distance and speak to each other face to face, which we wouldn't be able to dreamt of even 10 years ago. So I think there are lots of genuine innovations and genuine productivity growth, and I'm not convinced that we've had all the best ideas yet. I mean, one example would be artificial intelligence. So if you think about the kind of advances that we made in artificial intelligence, from self-driving cars to reading X-rays by computers, and there's lots of new things coming out from those. So of course, a pushback would be to say, well, you don't see those in the productivity numbers. So productivity growth slowed down in the mid-1970s at the frontier in the US, and it hasn't really got back to the levels that existed between 1945 and 1975, apart from a burst in the late 90s with the internet. But in my view, and it's a bit like this view that Chad Syverson and Eric Brynjolfsson from Chicago and now Stanford have been arguing, is that just like the second industrial revolution that Bob was focusing on, it takes a long time between inventing things and learning how most effectively to use them in new products. So, classic example would be like, electricity gets invented, but, you have to learn how to build factories which run 24/7 and the kind of production line to make cars a lot later before we learn how to use that invention in a way of raising productivity, which we'd see in the productivity numbers and eventually in wages. So I kind of think AI and some types of robotics, some types of synthetic biology, which can be used potentially to clean oceans or to make new types of food without meat. I think those are starting to kind of happen, but it takes a while. You've got to explore and experiment. You need management practices to change and organizational practices to change in order to make best use of those. So I think there will be, some breakthroughs, and maybe, I'm not sure they'll be as big as some of the Silicon Valley, my friends in Silicon Valley or in Massachusetts, MIT are saying. I mean, people say, well, we're going to approach a singularity, and then, machines will build machines, and then we'll all be able to sit around eating grapes on clouds. I'm not so convinced about, but I do think that these types of inventions have a good chance of getting us back to more sustainable productivity growth. So I think that there are hopes for that. I don't think all the good ideas have yet been plucked from the tree.
All right. So just before going to the next topic on this slightly speculative questions of the future of innovation. What is your sense about what COVID has done, this pandemic has done to innovation? There are many innovations like this, like Zoom, like video conferences that have been adopted massively because our lifestyle changes. Do you think that on the basis of other historical experience and what we are seeing around us, do you sense that this is going to generate a step change in things that would have taken decades to adopt are suddenly being adopted, and that we're going to reap some positive fruits of this nightmare that we have been going through for those 10, 11 months?
I mean, it's a fascinating question. So, I mean, normally, you have a bad shock and it's not good. It is a bad shock. It's not good. It's clearly COVID is an awful, horrible thing. And, it depresses demand. So firms don't want to invest so much in research and development and new technologies. There's uncertainty, massive uncertainty. That also retards incentives to invest. Firms have less money hit by financial crisis, because they're not getting customers. That also restricts how much money they can spend. So all those are kind of bad, are bad things. However, there are some potential silver linings, like you were hinting at. And I'd say there's at least two types of things. So one is that often crises are opportunities to do things that you weren't doing before. I mean, when you're selling lots of goods, you do things that kind of cost money but save time. But when you're in a downturn, you do things which kind of you've got more time on your hands, so you do things which maybe cost you a lot of time but save money. And this is sometimes called the pit stop theory, after Bob Hall's model of recession. So there may be something of that. It's a time when you can invest more in rethinking the whole business model that you had. I've been very impressed. Like some of our local grocery stores. We had a restaurant, and of course, when lockdown happened, they couldn't have people in the restaurant, but they overnight almost they used the fact they had a supply chain sending fresh produce, and they turn themselves into a fresh produce grocery store. So that's a kind of small innovation, but I think that's there's maybe a bigger picture where negative shocks can somehow cause you to do things. And a linked point to that is that there were a whole load of things that we were doing before, working from home, using Zoom, which there was a move towards that, but it was slow. And the shock of COVID has meant that people have, quickly shifted to almost like, the economics jargon, a new equilibrium. So, it was very difficult to coordinate on everybody. Some people want to work from home, some people don't. Once everybody works from home, you have to make the shift. You have to invest in platforms like Zoom for online conferencing, like group calendars. So it kind of forced a lot of firms to do that. Now, of course, that's costly, but if that was something which in some sense would have been more efficient if everybody did it already, it kind of pushed us to a new kind of equilibrium. So I think even when COVID goes, those investments which have been made in software platforms, that experimentation in new ways of working are going to persist. There's this nice paper actually from our old place in the Centre for Economic Performance, where a group of researchers looked at what happened when there was a tube strike, and they found that when there's a tube strike, because people couldn't catch the underground to go to work, they started finding new routes to go to work. And then when the tube strike finished, a lot of them carried on the new routes to work. And why did they do that? Well, there was this new ways of doing things, but they never made the investment to do it until they had that push to do it. So I think there is something around that which will mean that some of the changes will persist. So I think that's the silver lining. Of course, it's a big negative shock, but there are some ways in which the shock has stimulated more innovation. There's a little bit of survey evidence that I've seen that suggests there has been some greater innovation in the COVID period than we might have expected, given the negativity of the shock.
All right, that's a good news to hear. So let's leave innovation aside for now and focus on the second big strand of your work, which has been extremely influential on management. And some of the people watching or hearing this will be very surprised to hear that managers didn't really play a role in economics. You basically combine capital and labor and produce outputs. That's basically how economics is production, doesn't really get into what's actually managers do. And you've been actually trying to figure out, do managers work for, does actually management add value? Do they increase productivity? Are different practices differently important? One would think that this is something economists have been looking for a long time, and yet it's actually something that you, with Nick Bloom from Stanford, your student, have pioneered. What do you think we have learned? Tell us a little bit about where this research started, with all these surveys that you sent to all these places, and what have we learned? Let's
So another key player in this endeavor is Rafaela Sedun from Harvard Business School.
Also your student, and also somebody we intend to have in this.
Fantastic. She's brilliant. I sometimes actually think the Lost Einstein work we talked about should be called the Lost Marie Curie work, because one of the big things is we don't get enough women innovators and they get enough recognition.
That is.
So there's always been this subterranean thing in economics about the importance of management, all the way back from Adam Smith in his pin factories up to Bob Lucas, your former colleague at the University of Chicago, and the importance of managers. But I think one of the big problems has been just measurements, that it's very hard to measure management practices. It's much easier to kind of count up in the number of workers or the number of machines, and how do you measure management? So that was really, I think, our contribution, is we try to come up with ways of measuring types of management practices which we thought were related or closely related to core aspects of productivity. So things like, how are you monitoring what's going on in your firm and collecting data? How are you using that to kind of set goals? Are you then using that also to incentivize people in terms of their pay and productivity? How do you deal with underperformers and so on? And we came to that from talking to a very lot of industry experts, a lot of consultants, and we developed a way we thought, and this was kind of a consensus, I think, in a lot of the different industries we spoke to, about these things which would be important for measuring management practices. So we then went out and did that radical thing for economists, which people don't do, called talking to people. So we surveyed now over 20,000 managers. We started off in manufacturing, but we've also done hospitals and schools, and people have done our work in universities and other places. So we collected this data across, it's about 35 countries in the world, from many different firms. And I guess we found a few things which kind of stunned us, but maybe shouldn't have stunned the outside world, which is that there's just extraordinary variation in the quality of management. So even when you look within a single country or a single industry, there is a very, very large variation. So some firms are doing very well at trying to manage their workforce. Some firms are doing absolutely extraordinary. And for an economist, it is, especially those of us who are trained in let me say, the more Chicago school, it is slightly surprising, because you think the badly managed firms should be driven out of business by the well-managed firms. They won't be able to, sell their goods at the same price because they're less efficient, so they should disappear. And we do find that competition matters, but it takes a while for those effects to happen. So we see a lot of these badly managed firms persisting for long periods of time. The second thing we find, I guess, is that there is a very strong relationship between the management quality that we measure and the performance of firms. So of course, a worry we had was, when we're trying to measure these management practices, maybe they've got nothing really to do with productivity or profits or survival. So that's why. But in fact, the measures that we have, which are basically around an interview with a middle manager, like think about a plant manager of a factory. We'd have an interview for about 45 minutes, a bit like the one we're having now, and then we would use that open-ended interview to then to code up those answers in a kind of quantifiable way. And we found that those seem to be very strongly related to the productivity of the firm, the market value, the chance of survival, and so on.
What were the key issues that you see? There is heterogeneity of many dimensions. People do things in different ways. But what are the things that you actually looked at and thought, these ones really, really matter? Better firms do these things consistently better.
Well, there's kind of three dimensions. So one is you think of collecting data in a systematic way. So knowing default rates, knowing when things are going wrong, tracking your inventory. Just one set of things is around basic data collection and using that in a systematic way and looking at that, visualizing that. So a lot of people collect data but don't actually spread that around. The more efficient firms seem to be good at involving workers, talking through the data, trying to find ways to improve. So Toyota would be a good example of this. The kind of continuous improvement thing, I think, is a way of collecting information, listening to what the employees say, and using that to try and improve things. So collection of data, using that to set goals. So how you set targets, a lot of companies set targets, but some are impossible and they're too hard, some are too easy. So somehow using that data then to set goals, which are stretching, or which are a mixture of financial and non-financial, which are, not just too short term. So that's the second thing. And the final thing is like having incentives. So, you've got the data, you've got information on setting goals, but then you have to think about how you reward people. So you want to reward, if you have somebody who's, thinking about promoting them, are you going to just promote the person who's like, the eldest son of the founder? Or are you going to actually try and say, okay, I'm going to try and find the most able and hardworking person and promote them, how you deal with underperformers, how you pay people, and whole sort of things around, human resource management. Those are the three kind of blocks. What we didn't do, some of the new workers trying to do this, we didn't try and score things in terms of like, M&A, merger and acquisition activity, or R&D, or what industry. So those strategic things are super important. The thing, we focus much more on the kind of nitty gritty things, the kind of nuts and bolts, mainly because there's more consensus, I think, over what works and what doesn't work there. And it was easier to get information on those things. So that's kind of where we started in our
So one thing, being here in the European Parliament and watching different styles of work and there's always these jokes about, there's now a series about the Parliament, even with all these jokes about nationalities and so on. What is your view of what does the data say about different management styles? Are there different US and European practices? Is it different how German and Italian or Spanish or French firms are managed? What do we learn about management styles? Is there such a thing?
There is, I mean, like, the crude scores that we give have a clear ranking across kind of countries on the things that I've talked about. So, the US, Japan, Germany all do really well. They're all kind of I know in England we say the Premier League, the Champions League of manager relations. And then you kind of go down, and there's a pretty strong correlation between those overall scores and the productivity of the different countries. The poorest countries do worse, but you also see some different flavors. So although if you look within the if you compare the US to Germany and Japan, the Germans and Japanese do a lot better on that kind of collection of data and monitoring of data, and whereas the Americans tend to score more highly, or have different, they have much stronger incentive-based kind of management practices, so giving more rewards to people who are showing more talent, promoting people more quickly. So even though the average score is the same, you see these interesting kind of differences. Another dimension is like, and we've worked on this, decentralization of power. So you see a very strong cultural element of that. So Japan tends to be much more centralized, for example, than say the United States or Northern Europe. Asian countries in general seem to be more centralized than other countries. So there are lots of cultural differences. There's lots of differences to do with market structures. There's lots of differences to do with skills. That's an important factor. So there are definite differences, and some of those are countries specialize in different things. So it's kind of it's not a problem. But there is also an element where some countries potentially, if they could improve their management practices, could also improve their kind of wealth or well-being. We figure, in some of our work, we think, of the overall gaps of productivity, about 30% could be related to management. So that's a big difference.
It pays to improve it. John, I can't let you go without spending some time on Brexit. We are in one of the many.
You're making me suffer.
Yeah, one of the many weeks of the last 4 years in which we have some drop dead, fantastically important deadline.
Well, you should say today is the day that Boris Johnson is in Brussels.
Yes, supposedly today, but I anticipate that for the next 10 years we will be having life or death negotiations over this or that thing that will always go to the cliff edge. Europe was a way to solve all these conflicts. We without the European Union, we'll have to go to the old-fashioned ways, I guess. And you have been very
Let's hope not.
not that old-fashioned, not that old-fashioned, not fighting, but just struggling. So you have been very active on talking about the cost of exit. You had a Brookings paper that went over it already in 2016. You were very worried about basically getting much higher trade costs with the rest of Europe, where the UK is doing half of their trade and a very large amount of their investment. How does this analysis, which was talking about very large, up to even close to 10% in taking the dynamic effects into account, etc. How does this analysis hold up? How do you see the cost of Brexit evolving? What is your sense as an economist on how this is going to turn out in terms of costs?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the first thing I should say is I feel it's a great, personal tragedy that Britain is doing this. I mean, I think it's, one of those populist convulsions happening all over the world, which is going to have very, long run negative effects for Britain and the rest of Europe. So, I was, I did my own personal Brexit in 2016 to MIT from LSE.
Same here. I was that night in LSE. We were commenting.
I know. I saw you. I couldn't have borne to be there. Actually,
TV stations telling about this tragedy. Yeah.
But on the economics, so I think the first thing to say, of course, is that when a lot of the work I focused on was on the long run effects, and none of those really have kicked in yet, because Britain still is in the single market and the customs union as we speak, and we don't know exactly what the deal will be after the end of, what is it now, 3-4 weeks time. But whatever, even in the best possible deal, zero tariffs and everything else, there is still most of the costs which we were looking at are still going to be there, because if you think about the type of trade cost which will arise, some of them are to do with tariffs. There's like 10% tariffs on cars and agriculture goods, but most of them are actually not about the tariff barriers. Most of them about the rules and regulations which are now going to be imposed when goods and services go from the UK to Europe, or from the rest of the European Union to the UK. And that will be an immediate cost, but those costs will increase over time, because what will happen is, as Britain's regulations and standards diverge from the rest of Europe, that will make, these will be what economists call non-tariff barriers, which are the main actual form of trade barriers. Those will increase over time, and those will become increasingly costly. So I think that in terms of the economic pain of Brexit, it's like the kind of, it's like the domestic abuse that you get, these bruises which kind of accumulate over time. It will be some short, sharp shock in the 1st of January, but most of these are going to be accumulating over time. So I think the pain is going to be, and of course it's going to be less visible. So it's going to be harder for people to realize, I think, how bad it is, but the pain will be there anyway. In terms of the short run, so, we've had 4 years since the Brexit vote. And I think we've already seen, although this wasn't the focus of my work, it was the focus of many other people's work, we have seen, I think most estimates suggest that growth in the UK has been 2 or 3% lower than it would have been had we been in the European Union, because of the greater uncertainty, because of Brexit, because of the fact people realize there's going to be these trade costs and then cut back now on growth and investment because of that. And the Bank of England and the Office of Budget Responsibility already estimate there's about 2 to 3% cost which has already been borne. But my view is that most of the costs are yet to come, and they're going to be played out of the line. And those are just the economic costs. I mean, the political costs, as you say, are probably even more important. That if it leads to more conflict, just waste of time. The amount of time that civil servants, politicians, business people have had to spend on this, when we could have been putting our minds to much more important things.
To think that it was sold as no more red tape is just mind-boggling. I mean, just it's a customs form every time you send a FedEx. I mean, come on.
And I think also this. I mean, one thing this is a very final thought. Is I was listening to somebody, Brexiteer, this morning, talking about sovereignty. People say, "Oh, we can't sacrifice sovereignty," as if we were like Robinson Crusoe. We could have total sovereignty if we all lived by ourselves on the desert islands. Once we have to cooperate with other people, we lose some of our sovereignty. but we gain because we gain from cooperating with other people. Yes, you're giving up some of your, total personal freedom, but in exchange for being able to cooperate, to work with other people, to deal with all the real problems that we kind of face as in the world. So, I think, somehow, and I guess this is a bigger picture, if we have to move away from these kind of absolutist notions of, perfect pure sovereignty and everything else to the real world where we all have to make messy compromises. So.
To our eternal sorrow, I mean, we've always wonder if we did enough when we were together at LSE all those years where all this referendum talk and all that was going on, to explain that. I really tried. You also tried to explain all these things about shared sovereignty. Now I think I probably should have spent 2 of my years in England not doing any research and just talking about this. I mean, in terms of the welfare cost of this.
I spent. I don't think I could have spent any more. I mean, I think in retrospect, I feel like, oh God, I spent all that time and we failed. But on the other hand, if I hadn't have done that, I would have felt I'd have never have known if I hadn't have gone all in to try and do things and think about and explain to people. I'd have felt so guilty about not doing that. So I don't think I could have done any more than I did. I mean, that's.
I'm sure it was actually you were indeed extremely active and wrote papers and everything. Well, thank you very much, John. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Luis.
It's really great to have you on this side of the ocean, and hopefully in London or in Brussels or somewhere else we'll continue this conversation.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.